Hey friends, welcome to the channel. I'm Tirso. I use a grid for most, if not all of my projects, so I'm suggesting that you too should use a grid for most, if not all of your projects. In a previous video, I covered modular grids. If you missed that, there is a link in the corner. In this video, I'm covering column grids, for now 2 and 4 columns. This will be a series of grid videos. I just don't know how many there will be, so here is my second guide to using a grid. Setting up a grid is super easy. Here's our document. Go to Layout, Margins and Columns, choose how many columns, your gutter spacing, and that's it. Starting with the simplest grid, 2 columns. Designers don't use a 2-column grid that often because there's not much to work with, but there is still something to work with. Here is some content. I'll add some styling, and we start off easy using the grid exactly as is. The first thing to note is that our content is the same for both. There is the name of the restaurant, an image, a copy block, and a photographer credit. Since the elements are the same, we want to establish the design system for both. The obvious convention is to start with the restaurant name. I want to separate the text block, so I'll add the image next. Both photos share the same photographer credit. These were shot by Anna Knott. We don't need to mention it twice, so I'm going to style it as a gutter credit. And then the text. The other restaurant will follow this exactly. I'll remove the grid lines. This took almost no time. The information is clear. We utilized a grid. Wonderful. The spacing is a little arbitrary because when you use a column grid, you don't have any rows to work off of, which is fine. You just decide what feels best. I think we can add some hierarchy to the restaurant names by increasing the white space underneath. Granted that our images are identical in size, the scale of the crops aren't balanced. To fix that, we can zoom into the one on the right. We're looking at this as a single page. Our design system only works if it works consistently for every instance. If you look at this as a spread, now it becomes more apparent. Is the design visually interesting? No, but from a foundational standpoint, the design is in how easily we made the section to be scanned by our reader. I mentioned earlier that I prefer the images to separate the blocks of text. I just want to show you, if we kept the blocks of text together, we would run into some spacing issues because our text blocks vary in length. In theory, you could standardize it by aligning them. It's always hard for me to say that something is egregiously wrong, but I think the trapped white space gets a little odd. Some are close to the photo and others aren't. Since the bottoms of the images are flat, the white space at the bottom feels like a mistake. Something to consider, imagine this being 12 pages and then one annoying restaurant has too much copy. You would have to go back and adjust all the other pages. You could start with the image and run all the text underneath, but this isn't that different, just a variation of what we did. Okay, for this page, it only contains one of the restaurants. This time we have a title, some deck copy, a block of text, and then our image. I already styled it, so let's lay out the page using our 2-column grid. I'll start by centering the title. This isn't exactly at the top because I want some buffer up there. Again, there aren't any rows, so we decide. Contrary to the last example, our title spans both columns, which breaks the grid. The same idea for this. Next goes our image and then our text. I was waiting to see how our copy landed in height before deciding on the final height for the image. Let's remove the grid. If this was an actual page in a magazine, readers are flipping through pages and they would need a reason to stop. In this situation, I would say that we should do something a little more visually interesting, but still utilizing our grid. The simplest solution here is to make the image the hero, so I'll make it full bleed. Our text can sit nicely in the dark space on top, and then we adjust our crop to accommodate readability. I'll show you the grid again, and that's a second option. I've been showing the use of the grid symmetrically. A nice way to add contrast is to utilize the grid asymmetrically. Starting with our body copy, I'll use the grid as 2 columns on the bottom, and then the rest of the space can be used for headline and image. So I'll drop in the image. To make it asymmetrical, you can simply bleed it off to one edge. Here's where the rules become a little gray. No one ever said the entire design had to use a grid. Say their names. Since we've already used the grid, I want to design this header section in reference to the image so that it functions as a unit. We have some nice atmospheric space at the bottom. I'll drop in the headline treatment. Since our image bleeds to the right, I can emphasize that by right aligning the headline. And now all we have to do is make room for our deck copy. We could stop here, but micro design is always important. If we can create movement in our layout, we definitely should. What I'm looking at here is the egg drip, which brings you down to the two fries pointing to our headline. The F's and O's stack on top of each other simply by happenstance. They aren't aligned, which forms an angle. I think we can emphasize that even further by italicizing comfort. Now the movement feels just a tad better. Not necessary, just a stylistic choice. I want to do one more option, but with a looser use of the grid. Here I have all of the body copy using one column of our grid. Our deck copy can go next to it. We have all of the space underneath. We can fill some of that with an intro graph. I'll pull out the first paragraph and then align everything to the bottom. For contrast, we can run the intro graph larger than the body copy. I'll use a different style title for this one that's bolder, and then our image goes here for now. This is obviously not working so well. Everything we did previously, well, most everything, simply aligned to the grid. What we haven't done is use the grid for proportion. Ideally, the image doesn't go edge to edge, which will help make it less horizontal. We can determine a width systematically by drawing an imaginary line down half of the grid column. This gives us a proportion that relates to our grid in some way, which is 1.5 columns. I'll crop that in. For the height, again, we don't have any rows, so let the image determine the crop. I think this height feels better. Okay, now we align to the center of the grid, which no longer takes up the entire width, but we did use the grid to determine it. Again, effectively, no rules. I'll drop in comfort from the title. I want this section to feel like a group, so I'll overlap. I'll just change the color now so it's readable, and then food can overlap on top. Just to call out what's happening here, comfort is left aligned to the grid, the image is aligned to the center, and food is right aligned. We've created a space between our hero section and body copy. For consistency, I'm going to use the same space for the placement of the intro graph. Let's add some styling to this, some color, and we're there. Here are all the options. Depending on your approach to the grid, it yields different results. I'm moving to 4 columns because it relates to the 2-column grid since you can break the 4 columns into 2. Let me drop the content from our previous layout real quick. This definitely aligns to the grid, but it doesn't actually utilize a 4-column grid. Too often, designers will claim that they used a 4 or 6-column grid, but then they end up designing the page as a 2 or 3-column grid. I'm not really sure why that happens, but it does. So let's explore what makes the difference. Our approach to the grid won't change, but the layouts will vary because the grid is different. In the 2-column layout, we use the grid as straightforward as possible, so we'll do that again here. Starting with the first one, the image no longer needs to be constrained to that width anymore. We have another column to use, so let's extend that over. The title is losing some space. To call it out a little more, we can run it in all caps and bigger. For the copy, it can live in 4 columns wrapping the image. The other restaurant can just fit in the space below. I do want some separation, so I'll add a rule above the title. For the image, in the original, we kept them equal in size. This is too big for the space we have. Since we have more flexibility in the grid, we can create more contrast and scale between the 2 images by having one of them only use 2 columns. Our text will wrap the image as we did above. These 2 columns are sitting awkward, so I'll just flip them. Let's remove the grid and compare this to the 2-column version. They're similar, but different. When you talk about flexibility with more grid columns, the layout on the right can easily be rearranged to fit like this. Both are a straightforward use of a 4-column grid. This is the second example we did. The first step would be to switch our body copy to 4 columns. The body copy isn't lining up so well. It would take quite a bit of work to typeset this for everything to align and also not have any orphans. To make it easier, I'll pull out the intro graph again. By separating it, it removes the constraint of staying in 1 column. I'll expand it across 2, adjust the rest of the body copy, and everything aligns. Now we can style the intro graph. The text is obviously crashing into the plate. Instead of moving the image crop down, there's space on top, so align it to the top of the grid. Let's compare. just a slight variation because of the grid. Since we've knocked out the text to white on such a dark background, it's going to be harder for readability. The additional columns help with that, so I do think the 4-column is working better. If readability is still a problem, you could rearrange it to something like this. For this layout, there's not much we would need to do. A lot of this is the same, so I'll skip a few steps. Here is the adjusted text at the bottom. We've been styling that deck copy in the top left to reinforce that there aren't any rules. In this option, you could run it in the center. For contrast, we can change the alignment and then finesse a little more with scale. If you watch the Can You See video, you learned that you shouldn't have stacked text like we do here. I'll re-rag that and this bottom section is done. Now for the hero area, you can design this however you like. I think it looks a little odd right aligned, even left aligned. There's just too much space in this bottom area without the deck copy. I think this is fine. I'll remove the grid. Looking at it again, I don't have a good reason for the italic, so I'll revert back to regular. Let's look at the 2. Yes, the grid is different, but the biggest change here is the weight of the page. The crop of the image makes the 4-column a little heavier. I'm also biased towards the text styling in the 2-column layout. It just adds a different moment for the page. This is our last option. I'm going to remove the intro graph and add it back to the main body. For the previous examples, we've been running the text across all 4 columns, so let's not do that here. I'll run it across 3 columns instead, which gives us this nice open column for the deck copy. We'll style that and align the group to the bottom. For the hero, we don't really have to do anything to the styling. The width was determined using the half column of the 2-column grid. If it's aligned in a 2-column grid, it's aligned in a 4-column grid. The only thing I want to do is center this within the space on top. For me, the color distribution is much stronger in the 2-column layout. I think that's it for this one. That is 2 and 4-column grids. In the future, you can expect 3, 6, 5, and 7-column grids. I should probably do one on how to decide which grid to use. Comment below if I missed anything. I know I'm spreading this out, but I do like to be thorough on the channel. Check out more content and happy designing.